In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a seamstress is found dead, her final stitch piercing a cryptic note. Miss Marple unravels a tangled web of jealousy, betrayal, and hidden secrets, where every thread points to a killer hiding in plain sight. Can she stitch together the clues before the murderer strikes again? Chapter 1. A Thread of Unus. The village of St. Mary's Mead, nestled in a gentle hollow of the English countryside. Its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the soft amber glow of late summer. The air was warm, scented with honeysuckle and freshly mown grass, and the distant chime of the church bell mingled with the hum of bees, creating a symphony of rural tranquility. To an outsider, it was a picture of timeless peace, a place where the world's troubles seemed to pause at the village boundary. But to Miss Jane Marple, who sat in her cozy parlour with her knitting needles, crafting a soft grey scarf, St. Mary's Mead was a tapestry of human nature, its threads woven with quiet joys, hidden sorrows, and the occasional knot of malice. Her cottage, a modest affair with whitewashed walls and a steeply pitched roof, stood at the heart of the village, its garden, a masterpiece of order. Roses bloomed in vibrant clusters along the stone path, their petals catching the sunlight like tiny prisms, while lavender bushes, neatly trimmed, released their fragrance with every passing breeze. A small herb patched by the kitchen door thrived under her careful tending, and a wicker chair, placed strategically by the parlour window, offered a perfect vantage point to observe the lane. Miss Marple, her white hair tucked beneath a simple hat, her blue eyes mild behind her spectacles, appeared to the casual observer as nothing more than an elderly spinster, her days filled with tea and knitting. But those who knew her understood that her gentle demeanour concealed a mind as sharp as her needles, attuned to the slightest ripple in the village's calm. This morning, as she worked a particularly intricate stitch, her gaze drifted to the lane beyond her low hedge. The village was stirring, as it always did at this hour. Mrs. Price Ridley, her hat askew, bustled toward the post office, her stride purposeful as if on a mission to unearth the latest gossip. Young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, pedalled past on his bicycle, whistling a tune that carried on the breeze. And there, just beyond the bend where the lane curved toward the church, a figure hesitated, a woman, unfamiliar, her silhouette sharp against the morning light. She wore a tailored coat, its cut too refined for a casual visitor, and clutched a parcel wrapped in brown paper, her fingers tightening as she glanced at the cottages lining the lane. Miss Marple's needles paused, the faint click of steel falling silent. Strangers were not uncommon in St. Mary's Mead. Summer brought ramblers, and Christmas saw relatives descend, but this woman's manner was different. Her steps were hesitant, her head turning as if searching for a specific address, yet her eyes held a wariness that suggested she wished not to be seen. Miss Marple noted the parcel, its edges creased as if gripped too tightly, and the woman's gloves, fine leather that spoke of city wealth rather than rural simplicity. Trouble, she thought, often arrived in such guises, cloaked in elegance. But betrayed by a nervous glance, she resumed her knitting, her movements deliberate, but her mind was already cataloguing the details. The woman paused at Rose Cottage, a small, ivy-clad house that had stood empty since old Mrs. Tuttle's passing 6 months prior. The cottage, with its sagging gate and overgrown garden, had been the subject of village speculation, its lease recently taken by a newcomer no one had yet met. The woman knocked softly, then, receiving no answer, slipped a note through the letterbox and hurried away, her coat flapping as she disappeared down the lane. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. A note, a parcel, threads, but enough to begin weaving a pattern. The Women's Institute meeting that evening provided the perfect opportunity to gather more threads. The village hall, a sturdy brick building adorned with faded bunting, was alive with the chatter of women, their voices rising and falling like a flock of starlings. Mrs. Bantry, the colonel's wife, presided with her usual good-natured authority, her booming laugh cutting through the hum of conversation. Miss Hartnell, angular and severe, was lamenting the state of the churchyard's roses, while Mrs. Price Ridley, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of gossip, held court near the tea urn, her topic the mysterious tenant of Rose Cottage. She's a seamstress, they say, Mrs. Price Ridley announced, her voice carrying over the clink of teacups. Miss Eleanor Shaw from Bath, quite refined, with a manner that's almost too polished, if you ask me. But she keeps to herself, sewing all hours of the night. I saw her lamp burning past midnight, and those stitches of hers such intricate work, like something out of a London shop. Miss Hartnell sniffed, her thin lips pursing. Sewing at midnight. That's no proper hour for honest work. And why come to St. Mary's Mead? We've no need for fancy seamstresses here. I say she's hiding something. Miss Weatherby, Eva, the peacemaker, ventured a timid smile. Perhaps she just likes the quiet. Bath is so bustling, isn't it? And her work is lovely. I saw a dress in her window, all silk and embroidery. Quite beautiful. Miss Marple, seated near the back with her knitting bag at her feet, listened with an air of mild interest, her needles never faltering. Her pose was one she had perfected over years, encouraging others to speak freely while her mind sifted their words for truth. A seamstress, she thought, whose late-night labors suggested more than a passion for needlework. And that stranger in the lane, with her tailored coat and furtive note, could she be connected to Miss Shaw? She recalled her old friend, Miss Lavinia Pinkerton, who had once uncovered a theft by noticing a single misplaced thread in a servant's apron. Small things, Miss Marple knew, often led to great revelations. Mrs. Bantry, joining the group, chuckled. A seamstress in St. Mary's Mead. It's like something out of one of Raymond's novels. What do you make of her, Jane? Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with a smile. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting Miss Shaw yet, Dolly, but I'm sure she'll find our village. Revealing, the conversation shifted to the upcoming harvest festival, but Miss Marple's thoughts remained on the newcomer. A seamstress from Bath, working late into the night, her arrival coinciding with a stranger's secretive visit. She thought of the parcel, the note slipped through the letterbox, the woman's nervous glance. There was a story here, she was certain, and it was one that St. Mary's Mead would soon unravel. The following morning brought a fresh breeze, stirring the leaves of the sycamore tree that shaded Miss Marple's garden. She was pruning her roses, her small secateurs snipping with precision when her maid, Florence, appeared at the kitchen door, her round face flushed with excitement. Miss Marple, there's talk in the village, she exclaimed, clutching her apron. That Miss Shaw at Rose Cottage's been asking about the Haverfords up at the hall, wanted to know about Miss Lydia, the daughter, and whether she ever comes to the village. Mrs. Muggins says it's mighty queer. Miss Marple set down her secateurs, her expression calm but her mind alert. The Haverfords, you say? How interesting. Did Miss Shaw say why she was curious? Not a word, Florence replied, her eyes wide. But Mrs. Muggins saw her at the post office, posting a letter to Bath. Looked ever so anxious, she did. Like she was expecting bad news. Miss Marple nodded, adjusting her hat. Thank you, Florence. I think I'll take a walk to the village shop. One must keep up with the news, mustn't one? The shop, a cramped space filled with jars of sweets and stacks of newspapers, was a hub of village gossip. Mrs. Muggins, the postmistress, greeted Miss Marple with a knowing nod. "You've heard about Miss Shaw, I suppose," she said, leaning across the counter. "She's been asking questions, all right. Wanted to know if the Haverfords ever had visitors from Bath, and whether Miss Lydia was engaged. Bold as brass, if you ask me." Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "How curious. Perhaps she knows the family from her time in Bath." Mrs. Muggins snorted. "If she does, she's not saying. But I saw her yesterday, coming out of Rose Cottage with a parcel, same as the one that woman left the other day. Dropped it right in the lane, she did, and snatched it up quick when she saw me looking." "A parcel," Miss Marple murmured, her needles pausing in her basket. "How very interesting." She left the shop, her mind turning over the new information. The Haverfords were a reclusive family, their grand but faded hall standing at the edge of the village, its gardens overgrown and its gates rarely open. Colonel Haverford, a retired military man with a gruff demeanor, was seldom seen, while his wife, delicate and withdrawn, avoided village events. Their daughter, Lydia, a pale young woman with an aloof air, was the subject of much speculation, her rare appearances marked by a quiet intensity. Miss Shaw's interest in Lydia, coupled with the stranger's visit and the mysterious parcel, suggested a connection that Miss Marple was determined to explore. That afternoon, she decided to pay a call on Rose Cottage under the pretense of inquiring about a dress for the harvest festival. The cottage was charming but neglected, its garden a tangle of weeds save for a small patch of lavender near the door. Miss Shaw answered her knock, a tall woman with sharp features and a guarded smile. Her eyes, a striking green, held a flicker of wariness as she invited Miss Marple inside. The workroom was a study in precision. Spools of thread lined a shelf, patterns were pinned neatly to a board, and a sewing machine hummed softly in the corner. A half-finished dress, its silk shimmering in the light, hung on a mannequin, its hem adorned with intricate ivy embroidery. Miss Marple noted a small locked box beneath the table, its surface polished but scratched, as if frequently handled. "How lovely your work is, Miss Shaw," she said, her voice warm. "You must find St. Mary's Mead quite a change from Bath." Miss Shaw's smile was tight. "It's peaceful here, good for concentration. I'm afraid I'm rather busy, the orders to fill, you know." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her eyes drifting to the locked box. "I noticed your lavender outside, such a soothing scent. Do you use it in your work?" Miss Shaw's fingers twitched, but she nodded. "Sometimes. It keeps the moths away." They chatted briefly, Miss Marple steering the conversation to village life, the church, the Haverfords, the festival, while watching for any sign of unease. Miss Shaw was polite but reserved, her answers clipped, and when Miss Marple mentioned the Haverfords, her hand tightened on a spool of thread. As Miss Marple left, she glimpsed a torn scrap of muslin on the floor, its edge embroidered with ivy leaves, identical to the dress on the mannequin. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat with her tea, her knitting untouched. The stranger in the lane, the note, the parcel. Miss Shaw's questions about Lydia Haverford, the ivy-embroidered muslin, all were threads in a pattern that was beginning to take shape. She thought of her old friend, Miss Clara Winthrop, who had once uncovered a scandal by noticing a single misplaced stitch in a servant's sewing. Small things, Miss Marple knew, could unravel great secrets. That evening, her nephew, Raymond West, arrived, his tweed jacket and cigarette smoke heralding his usual flair for the dramatic. "Aunt Jane," he exclaimed, kissing her cheek. "What's this I hear about a new seamstress stirring up the village? Sounds like one of my stories. A mysterious stranger, a quiet village, a hint of intrigue." Miss Marple smiled, pouring him tea. "Perhaps, Raymond, though I suspect Miss Shaw's story is more complex than fiction. Would you care to visit her? A writer's perspective might be illuminating." Raymond's eyes gleamed. "You're up to something, Aunt Jane. I'll go tomorrow. Maybe she's hiding a novel's worth of secrets." As Raymond prattled on about his latest literary theories, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Rose Cottage. The stranger, the parcel, the ivy embroidery, the locked boxage was a clue, and she was determined to follow them. She picked up her needles, her fingers moving with quiet certainty, and waited for the next thread to appear. Chapter 2. The unfinished seam. The morning mist draped St. Mary's Mead in a silvery shroud, softening the outlines of its thatched cottages and cobblestone lanes. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of dew-soaked grass and fading roses, and the church bell tolled with a mournful clarity that seemed to carry the weight of the villagers' shock. News of a grim discovery had spread like a ripple across a still pond. Miss Eleanor Shaw, the seamstress who had taken up residence at Rose Cottage, was found dead in her workroom, slumped over her sewing machine, a half-stitched hem trailing from her lifeless hands. The village, usually a haven of quiet routine, buzzed with whispers, each voice tinged with disbelief and curiosity. Miss Jane Marple, her gardening gloves tucked into her basket, made her way toward Rose Cottage under the pretense of offering condolences. But her true purpose was to observe the scene where the village's tranquility had been so violently shattered. Rose Cottage stood at the edge of St. Mary's Mead, its ivy-clad walls and sagging gate lending it a melancholic charm. The garden, once a riot of colour under old Mrs. Tuttle's care, was now a tangle of weeds, save for a small patch of lavender near the door, its purple spikes swaying in the breeze. A crowd had gathered near the gate, their faces a mix of shock and morbid fascination. Mrs. Price Ridley, her hat bristling with indignation, muttered about the dangers of newcomers, while Miss Weatherby, clutching her shawl, looked as if she might faint. Young Tommy Pierce lingered at the edge, his bicycle propped against a hedge, his eyes wide with the thrill of tragedy. Inspector Craddock, a sturdy man with a perpetually harried air, stood at the cottage door, barking orders to a pair of constables as they cordoned off the entrance with rough twine. Miss Marple, her air one of quiet concern, slipped past the onlookers, her basket swinging lightly at her side. She had known Inspector Craddock for years, a man of action who preferred facts to fancies, and she anticipated his impatience. But her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing, and her mind was already sifting through the fragments of the morning's news. The seamstress poisoned arsenic, they said, in her tea. A deliberate act, not a random misfortune. And that stranger in the lane, with her tailored coat and furtive note, lingered in Miss Marple's thoughts like a loose thread in a tapestry. The workroom, reached through a narrow hall papered in faded roses, was a study in order disrupted by death. The sewing machine, an old but polished singer, sat on a sturdy oak table, its needle poised above a length of cream muslin, the hem half-stitched as if Miss Shaw had been interrupted mid. A pair of scissors, their blades glinting in the pale light filtering through a small window, lay beside the fabric, and a single drop of blood stark and startling stained the muslin's edge. The chair where Miss Shaw had sat bore the indent of her form, and a teacup, its contents cold and faintly discolored, rested on a side table. Inspector Craddock, his face set in a scowl, was examining the cup, his gloved hands careful not to disturb the scene. "Arsenic," he said brusquely to a constable, his voice carrying over the hum of the crowd outside. "In her tea, no doubt. About it, a nasty business, calculated, cold. We're looking for someone with access and motive." Miss Marple, standing quietly near the door, let her eyes roam the room. The workroom was a model of precision, spools of thread arranged by color on a shelf, their hues ranging from soft pastels to deep crimson. Patterns pinned neatly to a corkboard, their edges crisp, and a small locked box tucked beneath the table, its wooden surface scratched as if recently handled. On the floor, half hidden by a fallen spool of green thread, was a torn scrap of muslin, its edge embroidered with a delicate pattern of ivy leaves, unlike any design she had seen in the villages. Modest needlework. She bent to adjust her shoe, her fingers deftly slipping the scrap into her sleeve, unnoticed by the constable nearby. A faint scent of lavender lingered, not from the garden but from a sachet tucked in an open drawer, its fabric worn but fragrant, as if used to mask something less pleasant. "Miss Marple," Craddock said, catching sight of her, his tone a mix of exasperation and resignation. "This is a crime scene, not a sewing circle. I'll thank you to keep clear." "Of course, Inspector," she replied, her voice mild as milk. "I only came to offer my sympathies to the parish. Poor Miss Shaw, such a tragedy. Though I couldn't help noticing that muslin's such an unusual pattern, those ivy leaves, and that lavender sachet, so practical, don't you think, for keeping moths at bay?" Craddock's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. "Details, Miss Marple. We're dealing with a murder poison, deliberate and cold, likely some rival from her days in Bath, or a disgruntled client. We'll find the culprit without fussing over embroidery." She nodded, her expression one of polite deference, but her mind was alight with possibilities. Arsenic was no accident, it required intent, access, and opportunity. The muslin scrap, with its ivy design, was not mere decoration, but a clue. Perhaps a signature or a message left by the killer or by Miss Shaw herself. The lavender sachet, she recalled, was often used to mask odors, and she thought of a case from her youth where a housekeeper had hidden poison in a scented pouch to avoid detection. The locked box, too, intrigued. Hurts, scratches, suggested frequent use, or perhaps an attempt to force it open, and the drop of blood on the muslin head. Miss Shaw pricked her finger, or was it something more sinister? As she stepped back into the hall, Miss Marple noted the cottage's other details. A coat rack with a single scarf, its hem frayed, a small mirror reflecting the workroom's light, and a staircase leading to the attic, its door slightly ajar. She thought of the stranger in the lane, the note slipped through the letterbox, and Miss Shaw's questions about Lydia Haverford, as reported by Florence. Someone, she suspected, had wanted the seamstress silenced, and the answer lay in the threads of her life, threads that stretched beyond St. Mary's, mead to a past yet to be uncovered. Outside, the crowd had grown, their whispers rising like a tide. Mrs. Price Ridley, her voice sharp, was regaling Miss Hartnell with theories of city intrigue. "Mark my words," she said, "that woman brought trouble with her, sewing at all hours, asking about the Haverfords. Who does she think she is?" Miss Hartnell, her angular face set in disapproval, nodded vigorously. No good comes of strangers meddling in village affairs. I saw her myself, posting a letter at the shop, looking like she expected the devil himself to answer. Miss Marple, pausing at the gate, let their words wash over her, her mind sifting truth from exaggeration. The Haverfords, a reclusive family, at the grand but faded Haverford Hall, were an enigma in St. Mary's Mead. Colonel Haverford, a retired military man with a brusque manner, rarely left his estate, while his wife, frail and retiring, was a ghost at village events. Their daughter, Lydia, a pale young woman with a distant air, was the subject of much speculation, her rare appearances marked by a quiet intensity that set tongues wagging. Miss Shaw's interest in Lydia, coupled with the stranger's visit, and the mysterious parcel, suggested a connection that Miss Marple was determined to unravel. She lingered at the lavender patch, noting a snapped stem as if someone had plucked a sprig in haste. The scent was strong, almost overpowering, and she wondered if it served a purpose beyond repelling moths. She thought of her old friend, Miss Beatrice Lane, who had once found a stolen ring hidden in a flower bed, its glint betrayed by a broken stem. Gardens, like workrooms, held secrets, and Miss Marple's instincts told her that Rose Cottage was no exception. Back at her cottage, she sat with her tea, the muslin scrap laid out on her table. The ivy pattern was meticulous, each leaf stitched with care, suggesting a personal significance. She recalled the stranger's tailored coat, the parcel clutched tightly, and the note slipped through the letterbox. Had Miss Shaw been expecting trouble, or had she invited it? The locked box, the blood-stained muslin, the lavender sachet were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was determined to fit them together. That afternoon, she decided to pay a call on Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall, hoping to glean more about Miss Shaw's inquiries. The hall, with its manicured lawns and Georgian elegance, was a stark contrast to Rose Cottage's humble charm. Mrs. Bantry welcomed her with a flourish, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of gossip. Over tea, she recounted the scene at Haverford Hall's gate. Miss Shaw, her voice sharp, demanding to see Lydia, only to be rebuffed by the Colonel. It was about a debt, I think, Mrs. Bantry said, leaning forward, or perhaps a promise broken. She looked furious. Jane, and the Colonel, was red as a beet. A debt, Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking softly. How very curious. Mrs. Bantry's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. And that parcel she carried, Mrs. Muggins saw her drop it in the lane, then snatch it up like it was gold. I say she was hiding something, Jane. What do you think? Miss Marple's smile was serene. I think, Dolly, that Miss Shaw's stitches may tell us more than we realize. As she walked home, the village settling into its evening hush, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the Haverfords. Lydia, with her aloof demeanor, was at the heart of this mystery, she was certain. The muslin scrap, the lavender, the locked box, pointed to a secret that Miss Shaw had brought with her, a secret someone had killed to keep buried. She thought of her old neighbor, Mrs. Florence Carter, who had once uncovered a theft by noticing a single misplaced thread in a quilt. Small things, Miss Marple knew, could unravel great truths, and she was only beginning to see the pattern. Chapter 3. The Seamstress's Secret. The afternoon sun bathed St. Mary's Mead in a golden glow, its rays catching the cobblestones and casting long shadows across the village's winding lanes. The air was warm, scented with late-blooming roses, and the faint tang of wood smoke, but an undercurrent of unease lingered, stirred by the brutal murder of Miss Eleanor Shaw. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders, walked toward the village shop, her basket swinging at her side. Her knitting needles, tucked within, were idle, but her mind was a whirl of activity, piecing together the clues from Rose Cottage, the ivy-embroidered muslin, the lavender sachet, the locked box, and the drop of blood that had stained the seamstresses. Final work. The murder, she knew, was no random act, and the secrets Miss Shaw had brought to St. Mary's Mead were beginning to unravel. The village shop, a cramped haven of jars filled with sweets and stacks of newspapers, was a hub of gossip, its counter a stage for whispered theories. Miss Weatherby, the timid spinster who helped behind the counter, was sorting through a pile of letters, her hands trembling slightly as she glanced up at Miss Marple's entrance. "Good afternoon, Miss Weatherby," Miss Marple said, selecting a packet of tea with her usual air of gentle curiosity. "Such a sad business about Miss Shaw. I understand she was asking about the Haverfords. Did she mention them to you?" Miss Weatherby's eyes widened, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Oh yes, Miss Marple. She came in last week, ever so polite, asking if Miss Lydia Haverford ever visited the village, or if the family had callers from Bath. I thought it queer, her being so new, but she had such a refined way about her." Miss Marple's smile was encouraging, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "How interesting. Did she say why she was curious about Miss Lydia?" "Not a word," Miss Weatherby replied, glancing nervously at the door as if expecting interruption. "But when she paid for her stamps, I saw a photograph slip from her purse, a young woman, with a shawl embroidered with ivy leaves. It looked like Miss Lydia, though I couldn't swear to it. She snatched it up quick, like she didn't want me to see." Miss Marple's needles, though still in her basket, seemed to hum with possibility. A photograph, an ivy pattern, a link to Lydia. Haverford, the threads were tightening. "How very curious," she said, her tone light. "Did she mention anything else? Perhaps about her work or her time in Bath?" Miss Weatherby shook her head, her fingers fidgeting with a letter. Only that she was posting a letter to Bath, looked anxious, like she was expecting bad news. "And she bought a reel of green thread, said it was for a special order. That's all I know, Miss Marple." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the details. A photograph, a letter to Bath, an ivy-embroidered sholich was a clue, pointing to a connection between Miss Shaw and the Haverfords. She thanked Miss Weatherby and made her way to Gossington Hall, where Mrs. Bantry, with her flair for gossip, might offer further insight. The hall, a grand Georgian pile with manicured lawns and tall windows, stood in stark contrast to the villagers' humbler cottages. Mrs. Bantry welcomed her into the drawing room, where a fire crackled despite the warmth of the day, its flames casting a cozy glow over the floral wallpaper and polished furniture. "Jane, you're a sight for sore eyes," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, pouring tea from a silver pot. "This business with Miss Shaw has the village in a tizzy. Poison, of all things. Arthur says it's probably some jealous rival from Bath, but I'm not so sure." Miss Marple accepted a cup, her eyes crinkling with a smile. "It's most unsettling, Dolly. I heard Miss Shaw was asking about the Haverfords. Did you notice anything about her visits to the hall?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of a story. "Oh yes, I saw it myself. At the hall's gate, a week ago, she was demanding to see Lydia, her voice sharp as a needle. Colonel Haverford sent her packing, all red in the face, muttering about impertinence. I overheard her say something about a detour. Was it a promise? She was clutching that parcel of hers, the one Mrs. Muggins saw her drop in the lane. A debt, Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking softly in her lap. How intriguing. Did you notice anything else about her? Her manner, perhaps, or something she wore? Mrs. Bantry's eyebrows shot up. Well, now you mention it, she had a brooch silver, shaped like an ivy leaf. Rather showy for a seamstress, I thought. And her gloves fine leather, not the sort you'd expect for someone stitching dresses. I said to Arthur, there's more to her than meets the eye. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The ivy motif again, linking the muslin scrap to the photograph, and now to a brooch. She thought of her old friend, Miss Amelia Gray, who had once solved a theft by noticing a distinctive clasp on a stolen coat. Symbols, she knew, often carried weight beyond their design, and Miss Shaw's ivy seemed to weave a thread through her life and her death. As she left Gossington Hall, the sun dipping low, Miss Marple walked past Rose Cottage, her steps slow and deliberate. The windows were dark, the police having finished their search, but a faint light flickered in the attic, as if someone were moving within. Not Inspector Craddock's men, she thought, but someone else perhaps seeking what Miss Shaw had hidden. She recalled the locked box, the lavender sachet, the blood-stained muslin. Miss Shaw had come to St. Mary's Mead with a purpose, likely tied to Lydia Haverford, and someone had ensured that purpose remained unfulfilled. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, her tea cooling as she examined the muslin scrap under the lamplight. The ivy pattern was meticulous, each leaf stitched with a precision that suggested personal significance. She thought of the stranger in the lane, the note slipped through the letterbox, the parcel clutched tightly. Had Miss Shaw been expecting trouble, or had she invited it? The photograph, the brooch, the letter to Bathol pointed to a past that stretched beyond the village, a past that had followed her to Rose Cottage. That evening, as the village settled into its nightly hush, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the Haverfords. Haverford Hall, with its overgrown gardens and shuttered windows, was a fortress of secrets, its occupants rarely seen. Colonel Haverford's gruff dismissal of Miss Shaw, Lydia's aloof demeanour, and the family's reclusive habits suggested a history they wished to keep buried. She recalled a case from her youth where a village newcomer had stirred old grudges, leading to a tragic end. History, Miss Marple knew, had a way of repeating itself, and she was determined to uncover the seamstress's secret before it claimed another life. Chapter 4. A pattern of deceit. The morning sun rose over St. Mary's Mead, its light filtering through the ancient oaks that lined the village lanes, casting dappled patterns on the cobblestones. The air was crisp, with a hint of autumn creeping into the late summer warmth, but the village's usual serenity was fractured by the shadow of Miss Eleanor Shaw's murder. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag at her side, sat in her garden, her needles crafting a delicate lace pattern as her mind sifted through the clues. The ivy-embroidered muslin, the lavender sachet, the locked box, and the photograph of a woman resembling Lydia Haverford. The seamstress's death, she was certain, was no isolated act, and the threads of deceit were beginning to form a distinct pattern. The inquest, held that morning in the village hall, drew a crowd of curious onlookers, their faces a mix of shock and fascination. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively near the back, listened as the coroner outlined the sparse facts. Miss Shaw, a spinster from Bath, had died of arsenic poisoning, the toxin traced to her teacup. The workroom showed no signs of a struggle, save for the drop of blood on the muslin and the torn scrap with its ivy design, which the police dismissed as irrelevant. Inspector Craddock, his voice clipped, spoke of a possible rival from Bath, disgruntled client, perhaps, or a jilted associate, but admitted they had no leads. The verdict was murder by person or persons unknown, and the room emptied with a collective murmur of frustration. Miss Marple, however, found the inquest rich with insight. The arsenic, easily obtained as rat poison, suggested premeditation, and the absence of a struggle implied trust. Miss Shaw had known her killer, or at least not feared them. The ivy-embroidered muslin, the photograph, and the brooch mentioned by Mrs. Bantry were not mere coincidences, but markers of a deeper connection. She thought of her old friend, Miss Harriet Vale, who had once uncovered a blackmail scheme by noticing a monogrammed handkerchief. Patterns, Miss Marple knew, often held the key to truth. Determined to explore the Haverford connection, Miss Marple visited Haverford Hall under the guise of delivering a jar of her blackberry jam. The hall, a grand but faded estate, stood at the village's edge, its gardens overgrown with brambles and its iron gates rusted from disuse. Colonel Haverford, a tall man with a military bearing, received her in the drawing room, his manner polite but guarded. His wife, a frail figure wrapped in a shawl, sat silently by the window, while Lydia, their daughter, lingered at the edge of the room, her pale face expressionless. Miss Marple noted the silk scarf around Lydia's neck, its hem adorned with a delicate ivy pattern, strikingly similar to the muslin scrap. "Thank you for the jam, Miss Marple," the colonel said, his voice gruff. "We don't often have visitors. The hall keeps us busy." "It's a beautiful home," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm, "though I imagine it's quiet, with so few callers. I heard Miss Shaw, the seamstress, visited recently. Such a tragedy, her passing." The colonel's jaw tightened, and Lydia's fingers froze on her scarf. "She came once," he said curtly. "Wanted to sell us dresses. We had no need for her services." Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with a smile. Of course, her work was quite distinctive, wasn't it? That ivy pattern so unusual for St. Mary's Mead. Lydia's face paled, but she said nothing, her eyes darting to her father. Mrs. Haverford, stirring slightly, murmured, "Such a sad loss," but her voice lacked conviction. As Miss Marple took her leave, she glanced at the garden, noting a locked shed near the rose beds, its door scratched as if recently forced. A faint scent of lavender lingered, not from flowers but from a source she couldn't place. Back in the village, Miss Marple sought out Miss Weatherby again, hoping to learn more about the photograph. At the shop, Miss Weatherby was sorting postcards, her hands still unsteady. "Did Miss Shaw ever mention where she got that photograph?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. "The one with the ivy shawl." Miss Weatherby hesitated, then whispered, "She said it was a keepsake from someone." "Dear," but she looked frightened when she spoke of it, like it held a secret she didn't want to share. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The photograph, the brooch, the muslin or bore, the ivy motif, linking Miss Shaw to Lydia Haverford. She thought of the stranger in the lane, the note, the parcel. Had Miss Shaw come to St. Mary's Mead to confront Lydia, or to reclaim something? Lost, the locked shed at the hall, the colonel's unease, and Lydia's silence suggested a family with secrets to guard. That evening, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple walked past Haverford Hall, her steps slow. A light burned in an upstairs window, and a figure Lydia, she thought, stood, silhouetted, motionless. The shed, she noted, was now padlocked, its scratches more pronounced. She recalled a case from her youth where a locked door had hidden stolen letters. Secrets, Miss Marple knew, were often kept under lock and key, and she was determined to find the one that had cost Miss Shaw her life. Chapter 5. The lavender clutha dawn broke over St. Mary's Mead with a soft flush of pink, its light filtering through the mist that clung to the villagers' lanes and hedgerows. The air was cool, scented with the last of the summer roses, but the villagers' peace was fractured by the lingering mystery of Miss Eleanor Shaw's murder. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlour with a cup of tea, let her knitting rest as her mind turned over the clues: the ivy-embroidered muslin, the photograph of a woman resembling Lydia Haverford, the silver ivy brooch, and the locked shed at Haverford Hall. Each was a thread in a tapestry of deceit, and the lavender sachet from Rose Cottage, with its potent scent, was beginning to seem more than a mere household item. Miss Marple decided to visit the vicarage, where Mr. Clement, the gentle but nervous vicar, might offer insight into Miss Shaw's final days. The vicarage, a modest stone house beside the church, was cluttered with books and papers, its windows aglow with morning light. Mr. Clement, his round face pale, welcomed her with a flustered smile, his hands twisting a handkerchief as he gestured. "To a chair, Miss Marple. How kind of you to call," he said, his voice trembling. "This dreadful business with Miss Shaw has quite shaken the parish. To think such a thing could happen here." "It's most distressing," Miss Marple agreed, settling into the chair with her knitting bag at her feet. "You must have seen Miss Shaw at church, Mr. Clement. Did she seem troubled?" The vicar hesitated, his fingers tightening on the handkerchief. "Well, yes, now you mention it. She attended last Sunday, sat in the back pew. She slipped a note into the collection. Plate instead of coins, quite unusual. I gave it to the police, of course, but it said something about a debt unpaid and was signed with a little drawing of an ivy leaf." Miss Marple's needles paused, though her expression remained serene. "An ivy leaf," she murmured. "How curious. Did she say anything to you, perhaps about her work or her time in Bath?" Mr. Clement shook his head, his eyes darting to the window. "Not much. She asked about the Haverfords once, wanted to know if Miss Lydia ever came to services. I told her the family keeps to themselves, but she seemed anxious, as if she was searching for something." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the information: a note, an ivy leaf, a debt unpaid. The clues were mounting, each pointing to a connection between Miss Shaw and Lydia Haverford. She thought of the lavender sachet, its scent strong enough to mask more than moths. In her youth, she had known a case where a poisoner had used a scented pouch to hide the bitter odor of arsenic. Could the sachet in Miss Shaw's drawer have served a similar purpose? To test her theory, Miss Marple enlisted her nephew, Raymond West, who was visiting St. Mary's Mead with his usual flair for the dramatic. Over breakfast, she suggested he visit Rose Cottage, posing as a writer researching local artisans. Raymond, his eyes gleaming with curiosity, agreed readily. "A murdered seamstress, Aunt Jane," he said, buttering a scone. "It's straight out of a novel. I'll charm my way in and see what I can find." Raymond returned that afternoon, his usual swagger tempered by intrigue. "The workroom's like a museum," he reported, lighting a cigarette. "Everything in its place, except that locked box still under the table, and the police missed it. I poked around the attic, too, and found a bundle of letters hidden behind a beam, addressed to Lydia Haverford, signed E.S. Talked. About a shared past and a vow broken. Sounded personal, Aunt Jane." Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "How very interesting. Did you notice anything else?" "The lavender," Raymond said, exhaling smoke. "It's everywhere, sachets in every drawer, even in the attic. Smells like she was trying to cover something up. Miss Marple's thoughts raced. The letters, the ivy, the lavendrel, pointed to a secret that Miss Shaw had carried to St. Mary's Mead, a secret tied to Lydia Haverford. She recalled the stranger in the lane, the photograph, the brooch. Had Miss Shaw come to confront Lydia, or to reclaim something lost? The locked shed at Haverford Hall, with its scratched door, loomed in her mind as a place where answers might lie. That evening, as the village settled into twilight, Miss Marple walked past the hall, her steps slow. The shed was still padlocked, but a faint light flickered in an upstairs window, where Lydia's silhouette stood, motionless. Miss Marple thought of a case from her past, where a hidden letter had revealed a family's shame. The seamstress's secret, she was certain, was woven into the Haverford silence, and she was determined to unravel it. Chapter 6. The hidden stitch. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across St. Mary's Mead, the golden hues of summer fading into the cooler tones of evening. The village, still reeling from Miss Eleanor Shaw's murder, hummed with quiet speculation, its residents whispering theories over garden fences and teacups. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, walked toward Rose Cottage, her steps measured but purposeful. The clues were mounting: the ivy-embroidered muslin, the lavender sachet, the letters to Lydia Haverford, the locked shed at Haverford Hallland, each pointed to a secret that had cost the seamstress her life. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing patterns where others saw only chaos, was determined to find the hidden stitch that would unravel the truth. To gather more insight, Miss Marple enlisted her maid, Florence, whose knack for chatting with servants was unmatched. Florence, under the pretense of borrowing a recipe from the Haverfords' housemaid, returned with a wealth of information. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her eyes wide, "the housemaid, Jenny, says Miss Lydia was burning papers in the garden. Shed the night after Miss Shaw died. Saw her through the window, all furtive-like, with a candle and a pile of papers. Jenny swears she heard her muttering about a debt." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Burning papers," she murmured. "How very interesting. Did Jenny see what they were?" "Not clearly," Florence admitted, "but she found a bit of cloth in the ashes, the next day muslin, with ivy stitching, like the one you showed me. She hid it, thinking it might be important." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The ivy motif again, now in the ashes of Haverford Hall's shed. She decided to investigate the shed herself, under the guise of admiring the hall's roses. The garden was overgrown, its once pristine beds choked with weeds, but the shed, a small wooden structure, stood out, its padlock gleaming and its door scarred with fresh scratches. She bent to examine a rosebush, her eyes on the ground, and spotted a charred scrap of muslin half buried in the soil. Its ivy pattern unmistakable dot. As she straightened, she caught sight of Lydia Haverford watching from an upstairs window, her face pale and her hands clutching the curtain. Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her heart quickened. Lydia, she suspected, was guarding a secret, one that Miss Shaw had threatened to expose. The letters, the photograph, the brochiole pointed to a shared past, and the shed's contents might hold the final clue. That evening, Miss Marple placed the lavender sachet from Rose Cottage on her garden table, visible from the lane, hoping to draw out the curious. At midnight, a figure crept into her garden, Lydia Haverford, her movements swift and silent as she snatched the sachet and fled. Miss Marple, watching from her darkened parlour, noted the girl's panic. The sachet, she thought, was more than a scented pouch. It was a link to the poison that had killed Miss Shaw. The next morning, Miss Marple returned to Rose Cottage, accompanied by Florence, who distracted the constable on duty with a tale of lost keys. In the workroom, Miss Marple examined the locked box, its scratches deeper than before. She found a small key hidden beneath a spool of thread, its size matching the box's lock. Inside were patterns, neatly folded, but one bore a handwritten note to Lydia, a reminder of our vow. The handwriting matched the letters Raymond had found, and Miss Marple's suspicions solidified. Miss Shaw had come to St. Mary's Mead to confront Lydia, and someone had ensured she never left. As she left the cottage, Miss Marple thought of her old friend, Miss Clara Winthrop, who had once found a stolen will hidden in a sewing box. Hidden stitches, she knew, often concealed the greatest secrets, and she was determined to find the one that had ended Miss Shaw's life. Chapter 7. A confrontation in the garden. The evening air in St. Mary's Mead was cool. The sky streaked with clouds that cast a soft, ominous glow over the village. The murder of Miss Eleanor Shaw had left a pall over the cottages and the lanes. Usually alive with the chatter of neighbours, were hushed. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl wrapped tightly against the chill, invited Lydia Haverford to tea at her cottage, framing it as a neighbourly gesture to discuss the harvest festival. Her true purpose, however, was to test the girl's composure. For the Cluser ivy-embroidered muslin, the lavender sachet, the letters, and the charred scrap from the shed pointed to Lydia as the key to the seamstress's death. Lydia arrived promptly, her pale face composed but her eyes wary. She wore a simple dress, its cuffs adorned with delicate ivy embroidery, a detail Miss Marple noted with quiet interest. The parlour was cosy, with lace curtains fluttering in the breeze, and a tray of scones and tea set out on the polished table. Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements deliberate, her voice warm but probing. "Such a sad business about Miss Shaw," she said, offering Lydia a scone. "You must have known her, I think, from her visit to the hall. She seemed so interested in you." Lydia's hand trembled slightly, but she met Miss Marple's gaze. "I barely knew her," she said, her voice steady. "She came once, offering to make dresses. Father sent her away." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "How curious. I heard she mentioned a debt, or perhaps a promise, and her work, those ivy patterns, were so distinctive. I noticed your scarf has a similar design." Lydia's fingers tightened on her cup, her face paling. "It's a common pattern," she said quickly. "Lots of seamstresses use it." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle, though I couldn't help noticing the lavender sachet in her workroom. Such a strong scent, don't you think? Almost as if it were hiding something. Lydia's eyes darted to the door, her composure cracking. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice sharp. "I had nothing to do with her." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "No, of course not. Though I found a similar sachet in my garden last night, dropped by someone in a hurry, and the shed at the hall such a curious place to burn papers." Lydia stood abruptly, her cup clattering on the saucer. "I must go," she said, her voice trembling. As she hurried out, a small vial slipped from her pocket, rolling under the table. Miss Marple retrieved it, noting its faded label, a chemist's stamp from Bath, marked with a warning for arsenic. The next day, Miss Marple visited the hall again, this time to speak with Mrs. Haverford. The frail woman, her hands trembling, admitted that Lydia had been agitated since Miss Shaw's arrival, often locking herself in her room with letters she refused to share. She said it was a mistake from her past. Mrs. Haverford whispered, "Something from Bath. before we came here. Miss Marple's thoughts raced. The vial, the letters, the ivy all pointed to a secret Lydia had killed to protect. She thought of her old friend, Miss Eleanor Price, who had once confronted a thief with a single damning clue. Confrontations, Miss Marple knew, could unravel even the tightest stitches, and she was ready to pull the final thread. Chapter 8. The final thread. The twilight settled over St. Mary's Mead, its soft glow casting long shadows across the village's lanes and cottages. The murder of Miss Eleanor Shaw had gripped the village, and Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlour with her knitting idle, knew the time for subtlety was over. The clues: the ivy-embroidered muslin, the lavender sachet, the letters to Lydia Haverford, the charred scrap, and the arsenic vial formed a pattern of deceit that pointed to one person. She summoned Inspector Craddock, Raymond West, and the Haverfords to her cottage, claiming new evidence that would unravel the truth. The parlour was arranged with care, the tea tray set with her best china, the lamp casting a warm glow, and the muslin scrap and vial placed prominently on the table. Colonel Haverford arrived, his face stern, with his wife and Lydia, whose pale demeanour betrayed her fear. Craddock, his scepticism barely concealed, took the armchair by the fire, while Raymond, cigarette in hand, watched with eager curiosity. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but clear. Miss Shaw's death was no accident. She came to St. Mary's Mead with a purpose to confront Miss Lydia about a shared past. Lydia's eyes widened, but she remained silent. Miss Marple continued. The letters in her attic, signed E.S., spoke of a vow broken, a debt unpaid. The ivy pattern on the muslin, the photograph, the brochure linked her to you, Lydia. She was your friend in Bath, wasn't she? Perhaps more. Colonel Haverford's face reddened. "This is nonsense," he growled. Lydia barely knew her. Miss Marple's eyes met Lydia's. "The lavender sachet masked the arsenic scent, and the vial you dropped confirms it. You poisoned her tea, Lydia, to keep her silent about a secret, a scandal, perhaps, that could ruin your family." Lydia broke down, sobbing. "She wanted money," she confessed. "We had a scheme in Bath-forged documents to save our home. She threatened to expose me. I couldn't let her destroy us." Craddock, stunned, stood. "You're admitting it?" Miss Marple nodded. The shed held the proof-burned papers, but not all were destroyed. The muslin, the letters, the vial, they tell the story. Lydia was led away, her defiance crumbling. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting resumed, the final thread pulled tight. Chapter 9. The last bloomed. The morning sun rose over St. Mary's Mead, its golden light washing over the villages, cottages, and gardens, banishing the shadows of Miss Eleanor Shaw's murder. With Lydia Haverford's confession and arrest, the village exhaled, its tranquility slowly returning. Miss Jane Marple, tending her roses in her garden, reflected on the case, the ivy-embroidered muslin, the lavender sachet, the letters, and the vial had woven a tapestry of deceit, unraveled by her quiet observation. The Women's Institute took up the care of Rose Cottage's garden, planting fresh roses where Miss Shaw's sewing table had stood. The village, though scarred, began to heal, its residents resuming their routines. Inspector Craddock, visiting Miss Marple, tipped his hat. "You've a gift, Miss Marple," he said grudgingly. "We'd have missed the sachet entirely." She smiled, her needles clicking. "Just a matter of noticing, Inspector." As she watched the village from her window, Miss Marple knew secrets would always linger, waiting for another stranger to stir them. For now, St. Mary's mead bloomed anew, its peace restored, but her vigilance remained, ready for the next thread to unravel. The end.